In March 2026, a major report by Amnesty International sparked intense global attention. The report, titled "No One Came to My Rescue: Gang Rape, Sexual Slavery, and Mass Displacement of Women in Oromia," Ethiopia, presents grave allegations about violence during the conflict in Oromia. Sexual violence in conflict is one of the most serious crimes under international law. It demands urgent documentation, accountability, and justice for victims. No credible observer disputes that point. But the real question is this: did the report present a full and balanced picture of what is happening in Oromia? According to a detailed counter-analysis released by Digital Oromia, the answer is far more complicated. The analysis argues that the Amnesty report raises serious methodological concerns, particularly regarding sources, investigative standards, and the broader context of the conflict. To understand why this matters, we must first look at the background. Since 2018, Oromia, the largest region in Ethiopia, has been experiencing a complex armed conflict involving the Ethiopian federal government and the Oromo Liberation Army. The conflict emerged after political reforms allowed the return of the Oromo Liberation Front from exile, followed by a split that produced the OLA as an armed insurgent movement. Since then, the region has seen military operations, counterinsurgency campaigns, mass arrests, communication shutdowns, and widespread civilian suffering. In such an environment, investigating crimes becomes extremely difficult. Digital Oromia's analysis claims that the Amnesty report may rely heavily on narratives shaped by government-controlled information flows while overlooking the role of state-lined militias and clandestine security structures that operate in parts of Oromia. The critique goes further. It suggests that communication blackouts, restricted access to conflict zones, and politically influenced testimonies could significantly affect the reliability of evidence collected during the investigation. In other words, the concern is not about whether crimes occurred, because they clearly have in this conflict. The concern is about how responsibility is assigned, whose voices are amplified, and whether investigative standards were applied consistently. For human rights reporting to maintain credibility, it must meet the highest standards of neutrality, transparency, and evidentiary rigor, especially in highly politicized conflicts. When those standards are questioned, the implications extend far beyond a single report. They affect the global trust placed in human rights documentation itself. So, what exactly are the alleged flaws in the report? What evidence is missing? And how do information blackouts and counterinsurgency tactics shape the narratives coming out of Oromia? Next, we will take a deep dive into the war zone reporting analysis, examining the key arguments, the geopolitical context of the conflict, and the broader debate about human rights reporting in war zones. Because understanding conflicts like Oromia requires more than headlines. It requires careful analysis, context, and scrutiny of every narrative.
Welcome to today's deep dive. We've got a really intense mission today. We are unpacking a fierce counter-assessment that, heavily critiques a March 2026 Amnesty International report on the conflict in Oromia, Ethiopia. Now, just a quick heads up to you before we jump in. We're dealing with an active, highly politically charged conflict today. We aren't here to pick sides or endorse these views.
Right.
We're just acting as your guides to impartially unpack exactly what this specific text is arguing.
Exactly. So the original Amnesty report basically points the finger at the Oromo Liberation Army, or the OLA, for human rights abuses.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because the author of our counter-assessment throws a massive red flag on their methodology. They note that Amnesty based their sweeping allegations on just 10 survivor accounts.
10 accounts.
Yeah, from 2 specific districts, Sayo and Enfilo.
Right. And in a region of 40 million people, the author argues a sample size of 10 is just entirely statistically insignificant for proving an institutional policy. They flat out call the report an investigative failure.
An investigative failure? That is harsh.
What's fascinating here is the sheer difficulty of figuring out who actually committed a crime in this kind of war zone. The author emphasizes that identifying perpetrators isn't as simple as asking victims who they saw. I mean, have you heard of the Gachana Serna?
The regime protectors, right. These are those state-sponsored paramilitaries operating out in the bush.
Precisely. And they lack standard uniforms. In fact, the text argues they intentionally dress to look exactly like the rebels.
Right, to carry out what the government apparently calls ocean drying tactics.
Conventional war kan ta'ee fi riphee lolaa kan jedhamu kun garaagarummaa mataa isaa qabu. Conventional war kan ta'e meeshaa gurguddaa qabatee birgeediidhaan maal ijaaramee fuula duratti kan waraanu jechuudha. Amalli kaabarratti ture kana ture. Saraawitiidhaan jechaadha raayyaan. Kan riphee lolaa akkasii miti amalli isaa. Loojistiikii uummata keessaa argata. Guyyaa siviilii ta'a. Uummata wajjin oolaa waltajjii isin gaggeessan keessa hin oolu. Odeeffannoon argata. Nama dubbatu ilaala. Galgala deemee immoo tarkaanfii suukkanneessaa irratti fudhata jechuudha. Amalli isaa baay'ee wal xaxaadha. Kana balleessuun kan danda'amu akkuma qurxummiiti jechaadha. Qurxummii Paasifikii yookiin Atlantik Ooshinii keessa guurtee hin dandeessu. Guutumatti balleessuu yoo danda'ame bishaanicha.
It's a brutal metaphor, the idea being that if the insurgency is the fish, the civilians are the ocean.
So they clear out civilian bases.
Yeah, to leave the rebels gasping for air.
Exactly. So if the perpetrators deliberately look identical to the rebels, taking survivor testimony at face value without physical proof is incredibly risky.
Here's where it gets really interesting. The source claims the state isn't just blending in. They apparently have a secretive security committee explicitly designed to frame the rebels.
Yes, the Kuri Nginya. The text argues they orchestrate extrajudicial killings and then just pin the blame on the OLA.
And they have a chilling historical example to back this up.
They do. In 2021, 14 Karayu Oromo elders were massacred. State monitors immediately blamed the rebels.
But independent reporting eventually proved the killings were actually ordered by state security forces.
Right. The author's point is that if a government has a proven track record of staging massacres to frame their enemy, any new human rights report that ignores that history is just investigative negligence.
Definitely.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, we have to look at how Amnesty actually conducted these interviews. They did it remotely during severe communication blackouts.
Which is a huge problem because the Ethiopian government completely controls the telecommunications grid.
Exactly. The source argues those remote interviews become highly vulnerable to state curation and coercion.
And while the NGO focuses entirely on the rebels, the author is frustrated they are ignoring massive state-led asymmetric warfare.
Like the drone strike in North Shiwa in February 2026.
The one that killed a pregnant woman.
Yes. By ignoring technologically advanced aerial bombings and focusing so narrowly on 10 local cases, the text claims the NGO is inadvertently laundering the state's reputation.
Laundering the state's reputation. That is a punchy insight. And it's exactly why you, the listener, should care about this. Whether you follow the Horn of Africa closely or you're just interested in global affairs, this perfectly illustrates the sheer chaos of consuming human rights data during modern information warfare. Narratives are weaponized.
Data is curated.
Exactly. What you read is rarely the whole story. So what does this all mean? Ultimately, it means that taking reports at face value in these complex conflicts without understanding the underlying security architecture, like proxy militias, secret committees, and telecom blackouts, can lead to completely distorted realities.
This raises an important question. If a state entirely controls the telecommunications grid and functionally replaces local judicial systems with its own secret committees, is it ever technologically or legally possible for an international NGO to conduct a truly impartial, remote human rights investigation?
That is definitely something for you to mull over long after you hit pause. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive, and we will catch you next time.